Good morning. We're going to get started. This hearing is called to order, and to my immediate right is Council Member Kathy Gilmore Richardson. To my immediate left is Council Member Derrick Greene. This is the public hearing of the Committee on Fiscal Responsibility, Intergovernmental Cooperation. Purpose of this public hearing is to hear testimony on Resolution 200039, sponsored by Council Member Gilmore Richardson. The clerk will now please read the title of the resolution before the committee today.
Authorizing the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation to conduct hearings to determine the City of Philadelphia's preparedness for the possibility of an economic recession and the strength of the reserve stabilization funds.
Chair would like to recognize Councilmember Kathy Gilmore Richardson for some remarks.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and our Vice Chair, Councilman O'Neill, and Councilman Greene, and all of our colleagues here this morning. I also want to thank our panel of witnesses who are here to share their experience with us this morning. This is an important hearing to have, particularly just a few short weeks before the mayor's budget address to this council. What I hope we can gain from the testimony today is a sense of where our city stands in regards to preparedness to weather another recession, as well as suggestions for how the city can be ready going forward. Last year, at the end of the fiscal year, as a result of careful budgeting and responsible spending, the city had a surplus. Based on Q2 projections, we anticipate having another surplus this year, and it's more than earlier projected, but less than we ended with last year. Many stakeholders will see this surplus as an opportunity to ask for more and to spend more money. As duly elected representatives of the people of Philadelphia, we are charged with being responsible with our city's finances. In 2007, the nation entered into an economic recession, then called the Great Recession. Banks stopped issuing loans, businesses failed, and our city's revenue went abruptly downward. We were ill prepared for the ramifications that come with an economic recession, and it is our responsibility now to learn from our past mistakes and ensure that our city is prepared to weather whatever comes to us, particularly from the standpoint of how we spend and save our city's revenue. Since 2007, we have taken steps to prepare. The city has 4 reserve funds, which we'll hear more about later. And while it is important to ensure that we allocate funding for the essential functions of running our city, it is our role to ensure that we prepare for the event of an economic downturn. And on a point of personal privilege, I just want to mention that I was a legislative aide here in City Council during the last recession, and I remember a lot of the tough choices we had to make during that time, and looking at the services we provide as a city and how we were going to continue to be responsive to our constituents, and I never want to have that feeling ever again. I remember having to do a bill at the very last minute in June, I believe, for the district, around $30 million during that time for the school district of Philadelphia. And I think now that we have a surplus, it's a great opportunity for us to talk about how we prepare for any potential economic recession that may come our way. So thank you all so very much for being here. Thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion and use this as a framework as we go into our budget hearings, and I look forward to the outcome of this hearing and sharing that information with all of my colleagues on Philadelphia City Council. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson. This is a very important topic, and we appreciate you bringing this forward. Will the clerk please call the first panel of witnesses?
Harvey Rice.
Please state, good morning.
Good morning.
Please state your full name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Harvey Rice, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority. Good morning, Chairperson Dom and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify on resolution number 200039 today regarding the state of the reserve fund and the city's ability to weather an economic downturn. Although the city is on better fiscal footing than it has been for years, or maybe even decades, PICA does not believe it is in the strongest financial position to weather a severe economic downturn. As you know, PICA annually reviews and approves the city's 5-year plan. In our staff report on the 5-year plan, we identify key risks that can impact the city's plan over the next 5 years. In our staff report on the current 5-year plan, we identified economic growth, or a potential lack thereof, as a key risk that might impede the city's ability to realize their projected revenues. Fortunately, to date, the economy has continued its expansion, and therefore city tax revenues are coming in as projected, if not even higher. However, we all know this good fortune will not last forever, and city officials have been taking measures to protect our city from any possible future decline in revenues due to an economic slowdown. PICA has long advocated for a rainy day fund to prepare for an economic slowdown. As such, we were pleased when City Council adopted the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund, or Rainy Day Fund, back in 2011. Unfortunately, it took another 9 years to initiate the funding of the reserve. As part of the current 20 to 24 5-year plan, the city made its first ever deposit of $34.2 million, with an additional $146.5 million projected to be deposited by the end of the 5-year plan, for a total of $180 million. However, even this 5-year projection would only pay the city's payroll for a matter of weeks should revenue plummet during a significant economic downturn. Additionally, there is a possibility, as we have seen in the past, that the BSR contributions may not be funded as originally projected. For instance, in past plans where the city has projected contributions to the BSR, other contingencies have taken precedent, which ultimately eliminated the contribution to the BSR. Furthermore, we are concerned that the expiring labor contracts for all 8 labor unions upcoming at the end of June 2020 might result in more foregoing BSR contributions in the future plan. Hopefully, we will see this commitment to fund the BSR continue in the FY 21-25 5-year plan. PICA has also advocated for voluntary contributions to the BSR, even if the revenue threshold that would trigger deposit is not met. Another factor to be considered when assessing the city's preparedness for an economic downturn is the general fund balance. In FY 2019, the year-end fund balance was $438.6 million, or 9.2% of general fund obligations. This was $140.9 million more than the projected $297.7 million, and signified the second time the city met or exceeded its internal target for a fund balance which is between 6% and 8% of obligations. Despite the recent larger fund balances since 2018 and higher projected fund balances in the 2024 5-year plan, fund balances remain below the Government Finance Officers Association, the GFOA, recommendation of 17% of obligations. As mentioned previously, the city has established an internal target fund balance of 6 to 8% of obligations. In the current 2024 plan, the city projects fund balances to range from 4.2% of obligations in FY20 to a low of 2.5% in FY22. Therefore, if an economic downturn occurred, higher fund balances would help the city lessen the impact on city services in the short term. PICA recognizes the city's efforts to ensure larger fund balances in the current plan and hopes the city will continue this direction by increasing fund balances to meet GFOA recommendations. In recent 5-year plans, the city has also established a contingency for federal funding cuts, which represents money set aside in the event of potential federal cuts to grant money. PICA advocated for such a contingency planning at the beginning of the current presidential administration. However, although the risk of funding cuts from the federal government has been minimal to date, the city continues to set aside money in this reserve. Going forward, the city plans to use this reserve as a contingency for a recession or economic downturn. We must keep in mind that this reserve, along with the provision for future labor costs, are included in the year-end fund balance. In conclusion, although the city has made significant strides towards short-term fiscal stability, overall it is not sufficient to weather a severe recession or economic downturn. PICA will continue to monitor the city's commitment to higher fund balances and contributions to the city's BSR to better prepare us for an economic downturn. Thank you for allowing me to testify, and I am available to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Rice. I have two questions, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Councilmember Derrick Greene. In your opinion, is the biggest financial burden on our budget the pension obligation?
I would say yes, it is if it's not the biggest, it's one of the top biggest drain on the city's general fund.
And currently, does that represent in the neighborhood of 16 to 17% of the annual budget?
Yes.
And if that was funded, how much would that represent of the annual budget? If it was fully funded, what would be the actual percentage of the annual budget?
I'm not sure. I'd have to check that.
Okay. And then, last but not least, has it been...
We're at $6.1 billion unfunded liability. We're 46.8% funded of the pension.
Have we given any thought, is there any possibility of utilizing assets that the city owns in exchange for not having to pay obligations and pledging those assets as part of that requirement?
We just started to look into that within just a few weeks, so I really don't have an opinion on that yet. I mean, there's always the thing, once an asset is sold, and you have that money's then used and gone. Right. So we have to weigh that. What we also think is, and I think council has talked about this, is pilots with nonprofits and institutions, that maybe something like that could help generate more revenue into the revenue.
But I guess what I'm talking about, I think other states have done this. They pledge assets instead of making payments against the obligation that frees up the cash. Mm-hmm. And I guess my point in bringing this up is that could be a contingency plan in case we did have a downturn, or we can even look at it now, but that could be one of the contingency plans.
Yes.
That we could put in place.
As many contingency plans as we can have in place to ensure that when a recession or an economic downturn hits, that we have more money, revenues and funds available to weather that storm.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Councilmember Greene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Rice, for being here. Thank you for your work at PICA. Your testimony echoes some of the information that we talked about a few months ago when we had the one-day conference with Pew. And I think your testimony information you presented with PICA once again reinforced the need to make sure that PICA stays in existence. As we all know that PICA, the enabling legislation for PICA will expire 2023. We'll be continuing the conversation that I started regarding the future of PICA through hearings. We also know the impact of what would occur to the city of Philadelphia if that enabling legislation were to not stay in existence. Further, as I stated in the past, and I still believe we need to have an independent fiscal office in the city of Philadelphia. Some would call that a local Congressional Budget Office. I see that as a possible role for PICA in the future as we look forward to reauthorizing the PICA legislation. But that's a conversation for another day. But I wanted to focus a little bit more on your testimony today. And you made reference to a couple key points. One, the federal contingency that we've been carrying for about $50 million for the past couple of years since this current administration came into office. One of my questions, considering that our fund balance has been higher than in the past years, but still not at the level it should be based on cities of our size or based on GAO recommendations. Would you suggest we increase that federal contingency, or do you think that's the right size at this point?
If we're going to use that as a recessionary reserve, I would increase it. I would recommend to increase it.
Well, not necessarily as a recessionary reserve, although it could be used for that if we do
Right.
get to a recession. But considering the fund balance has been higher than it's been in past, and this is we have a need to put more money into the rainy day fund or the stabilization reserve. But at the same point, you don't want to put something in there and taking it out.
But if
So let me, if I can finish. So would you think it would make more sense to put some more additional dollars into, or at least budget additional dollars for that contingency fund?
Yes, because when at the end of the year, that is rolled over into your fund balance. So
Right.
that would make the fund balance bigger, and it's better budgeting and better planning.
Okay. And have you any thoughts on what that additional amount should be?
I haven't.
Okay.
We haven't looked at that yet.
Okay. Maybe as you continue to look at the 5-year plan, that's something that you may want to opine on at some point in the future. Also, in reference to the BSR, or the Budget Stabilization Reserve or Rainy Day Fund, do you think that the trigger for that should be changed? You made reference to the fact that it was adopted, but it was about 9 years before any deposits actually went into the BSR. Do you think that number, if that trigger should be changed at all?
I don't know yet. I remember it was the budget for FY19. If the city would have put $2 million more, it would have triggered a contribution to the BSR. So if they would have lessened the Federal Reserve by $2 million or raised the revenue projections, so we would have had, at that year, we would have had a contribution to BSR. But I haven't looked at what level would be a good level.
You made reference to our city labor contracts, which are coming up. And although we're not projected to go into recession at this moment, we have been in a very long bull market, one of the longest that we've had in the history of this country. And we are going through some significant pressures from the impact of the coronavirus, which will probably depress manufacturing and also the import-export market, at least probably going to the third quarter and maybe the fourth quarter. If you look at GDP for the country, it has not been at the robust levels that some who are currently in office would like to see. I think part of that is that we are a very mature country. The workforce is aging, as my father would say, is seasoned. And so when you look at all those factors, do you have any concerns in reference to the ability to address some of the issues in our labor contracts, as well as all of the fiscal concerns we have, and from a global perspective impacting Philadelphia? Even though we're not right at a recession, we could be in a short time period.
Could you ask the question
I'm just
again?
concerned in reference from the ability to put additional dollars in either the budget stabilization reserve or the federal contingency, considering some of the macro issues I talked about, and at the same point we have the pressures of resolving our labor contracts.
I remember when I first was appointed executive director at PICA. I think the first plan that I saw, there was no labor reserves. There was no money for labor contracts. And so working with the city, we said, this is not acceptable. You need to, at least put something in there, understanding the dynamics of how much do you put in, and then what becomes the starting point for any labor negotiations. In this plan, I think there's $140 million over the life of the plan for labor cost, and we projected a conservative that a $240 million over the life of the plan. That's a 2% conservative raise. So that would be like $102 million more than what the city has already put in as reserve. So I would use that as a starting point.
And one last question. Do you have any concerns in reference to the current status of the school district, considering that in the out years of the 5-year plan, the school district will have some significant financial issues from a perspective of having a negative deficit, and that becomes pretty large in the out years.
Right.
And that impact it will have on the city of Philadelphia from our ability to deal with both the labor contracts as well as trying to increase our fund balance and also provide more dollars into the rainy day fund as well as maintaining the federal contingency.
Yes, the school district situation in the out years going forward was a risk that we saw when we analyzed the current 5-year plan and issued our report on it, because it shows deficits in 2022 of $76.4 million, rises to 186 in 23, and almost 324. So that, and with the city's commitment to fund the school district and local control, we saw that as a risk to the plan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Greene, and I want to recognize some council members that have joined us. To my immediate right, Councilmember Cindy Bass, and to my left, Councilmember Mark Squilla, and the Vice Chair of the committee, Councilmember Brian O'Neill. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony, and appreciate it, and thank you for all your work at PICA, too.
Thank you
very much. Will the clerk please read the next panel? Or call the
Marisa
next panel.
Waxman.
Please state your full name for the record and proceed with your testimony. And I want to acknowledge, I believe I see your mom here too.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning, Chairperson Dom and members of the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation. My name is Marisa Goren Waxman, and I'm the Budget Director for the City of Philadelphia. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you today to talk about the city's fiscal health. With me is Rob Dubow, the city's Finance Director. I'll cut right to the chase. We are better prepared for the next recession than we were for the last one, thanks to intentional actions by the administration and City Council, but we still have tremendous weaknesses in our fiscal health. These weaknesses will put at further risk vulnerable Philadelphians who rely upon city services in the next recession, when demand for those services can be expected to grow. Given this reality about our current fiscal condition and the needs of Philadelphians, it is essential that we continue to be intentional about improving our fiscal health as a city. Right now, we are in a prolonged period of economic expansion, allowing the city to recover from the last recession by investing more in city services, while at the same time shoring up our long-term fiscal health by creating reserves for future needs. The city's economic consultants expect the national and local economic expansion to continue a bit longer, with just a 25% chance of a recession in 2021. But our chances of making it through the entire FY21 through 25 5-year plan without a downturn are slimmer. In a recession, we can expect that revenues will decrease, our fixed costs already a significant portion of the city budget, would stay the same or even grow, and demand for city services will grow. With our high poverty rate, weak tax base, and large fixed cost, Philadelphia remains vulnerable to a recession. When evaluating our most recent general obligation bond issue in November 2019, Moody's noted, quote, some persistent weaknesses like the city's very high poverty and above average unemployment rate. Two of our biggest fixed costs, debt service and pension payments, account for over 20% of our budget. That means if we have to make choices about how to react to a recession, a fifth of our budget will be untouchable. Even with those high fixed costs, the city is better positioned for the next recession compared to the last one. We've taken a number of steps to get here. These include stress testing our budget, increasing pay-as-you-go capital spending, increasing our fund balance, and setting aside reserves. In late fall, we analyzed the impact on revenues during the last 3 recessions to assess the scale of losses we could expect under different conditions given our current level of reserves. If revenues grow half as much after FY20 as what we currently anticipate through FY24, Philadelphia would lose $263 million in revenue compared to the adopted 5-year plan. If revenues do not grow at all after FY20, Philadelphia would lose $1.3 billion compared to the adopted 5-year plan. And if revenues declined by 3% in FY21 and FY22, and then hold steady through FY24, Philadelphia would lose $1.9 billion compared to the adopted 5-year plan. In all but the mildest recession scenario, the city's fund balance could quickly turn negative with deficits over $100 million as early as FY22, and the city would be forced to make painful budget choices. Our pay-as-you-go funding for capital projects with operating dollars, rather than by issuing debt, avoids borrowing costs while addressing critical infrastructure needs. We have increased the fund balance in recent years, meeting and even slightly exceeding the administration's goals of 6 to 8% of expenditures. The city ended FY19 with a fund balance of $439 million, 9% of the budget. While this is a significant improvement, I must point out that it falls far short of what other major cities do and of the Government Finance Officers Association recommendation of 17% of fund balance, enough to pay 2 months of city bills. Philadelphia has set aside other reserves for specific costs or scenarios in the future. This has included more than $50 million per year in the FY20 to 24 5-year plan as a reserve against reductions in federal funding. The city has also reserved funds for upcoming labor contracts and made a $34 million payment into the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund, aka the Rainy Day Fund. Also, the higher than anticipated ending fund balance in FY19 enabled setting aside another $20 million into a recession reserve. These reserves cushion us so that new costs or unexpected revenue losses don't immediately require service reductions and spending cuts. The improved fund balance has also allowed us to put additional money into the pension fund, which will help the fund get to full funding more quickly. In a December 2019 report on the recession readiness of the 25 largest cities, rating agency Moody's acknowledged our progress, noting that Philadelphia, like 17 other cities, is moderately prepared for the next recession. 6 cities were rated stronger and 2 were rated weak. Moody's said that Philadelphia is better prepared than it was in the last recession because we have begun building up a fund balance, we've made contributions to the Rainy Day Fund, and began the recession preparedness planning. Despite this progress, when we evaluated the impact of different recession scenarios on Philadelphia this past fall, we found that on all but the mildest scenarios, Philadelphia's current fund balance would not be enough. Moody's also highlighted our weaknesses. Our fund balance as a percent of revenues ranked second worst, 24th out of 25 of the largest U.S. cities. Despite the significant progress, Moody's recommends that Philadelphia grow its reserves and maintain fund balance percentages at levels equal with its peers, which was 24.3% in 2007 going into the last recession and 32.4% in 2018. They shared that Philadelphia is the only city in the top 25 that didn't have an FY18 fund balance that was larger than the decline in its fund balance during the last recession. Philadelphia has made progress, but remains in weaker fiscal health than we should be. Next week, on March 5th, Mayor Kenney will propose the administration's FY21 budget and FY21 through 25 5-year financial plan. As with past plans and budgets, it will seek to balance the trade-offs between addressing immediate service demands and maintaining stable finances so that we can continue to meet the needs of Philadelphians in each year of the plan and beyond, even in an economic downturn. We look forward to working with City Council to continue improving Philadelphia's fiscal health. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Why don't we have all the testimony, then we'll come back to you with the questions. Rob?
Oh, no.
That was it.
Oh, you're not testifying? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Councilmember Gilmore Richardson?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony. First, could you just break down for us the 4 different funds?
Certainly. First, we have the Budget Stabilization Reserve, or the Rainy Day Fund. That is one that has a trigger having to do with the amount of revenues that come in, and then a certain percentage getting deposited when there is enough revenue available. And that has sort of the strictest rules in terms of when money can come out. So the very first payment ever came in during FY20, that was $34 million. The current 5-year plan anticipates deposits into the Budget Stabilization Reserve throughout the current plan. The second reserve we have is the federal funds reserve. Starting in 2016 with the current presidential administration, the administration thought it was prudent to create a reserve against the potential for lost federal funding. And that is funded in the around the over $50 million in each year of the current plan. At the end of FY19, given the larger than expected fund balance, we were able to deposit $20 million into a recession reserve. We're actually beginning to sort of, those last two, the federal funds reserve and the recession reserve, combine those and rebrand as a recession reserve to hedge against lost revenues, whether that's from federal sources, revenue sources, whether that's policy decisions or economic conditions. And then the fourth is the labor reserve. As was mentioned during the last testimony, all 4 city contracts are expiring at the end of June, and we anticipate there will be additional costs. And so the current 5-year plan includes $140 million anticipated against those increased labor costs going forward. So those are the 4 reserves we have.
Thank you. Quickly, yesterday there was an article in the New York Times, CNN, and a bunch of other publications around how the spread of the pandemic of coronavirus has impacted our economy and increased fears for an economic downturn. Can you talk about our city's preparedness around that issue?
Certainly, and so that's something that obviously us and the economists that the city consults with are looking at. And when we actually started our recession planning, obviously it's something that's always on our mind, but in November we started to really stress test. And at that moment, it was an inverted yield curve and a trade war with China that we were concerned that that economic break with China would have an impact on us. Now, obviously, those concerns have pivoted towards both the coronavirus and the pandemic and whether that's a different economic break. Different sources can have disparate impacts, but what we've been doing is trying to model sort of various levels of recession and what that means on our budget to try and figure out, okay, if it's small, medium, or large, if it's short or it's long, so that we can understand. A lot of our goals, the last recession, it was long, it was deep. Hopefully the next recession doesn't have those characteristics, but a lot of what we're trying to do by building up these reserves is buy time so that we can have thoughtful responses. If it's a short recession, enough to get us through. If it does turn out to be longer and deeper, that we have some time so that we can make thoughtful decisions.
Also, right now we're in the longest period of economic growth as an overall economy. And typically when we project, the city projects the fund balances is a certain percentage of our obligations. So can you talk about why that is decreasing over time and not increasing? So,
and next week we'll be coming out with the FY21, FY25 plan with a new set of fund balance projections. But really there's this constant trade-off for us. We understand that, you know, to really be prepared for a downturn in the future, we would want a higher fund balance. The Government Finance Officers Association suggests 17%, 2 months of bills in the bank. And, you know, I think of the lady on WHYY telling you, you know, you need 6 months of an emergency fund. But what we also realize is Philadelphia is a city with a lot of needs today, that for a lot of Philadelphians, it's already raining. And so as we try and balance both of those two things together, that's where we're constantly having that push and pull about investing in services for vulnerable Philadelphians today, as well as making sure we have them beforehand. And so budgets are simply a series of trade-offs, and those are the trade-offs that we have had to make over time.
Sure, and also, could you just react to the report that was released yesterday relative to the quarterly overtime update?
Certainly. So one of the things, so yesterday we released the quarterly city managers report, which each quarter the budget office provides this quarterly update that looks at our revenues, our spending, our performance across the city to figure out whether we're on track and off track. And so one of the things we do look at is overtime spending. And so the most recent quarterly report did show that there was an increase compared to the same quarter the prior year. That's about 13% of our overall spending on Class 100, our wages. And actually, helpfully last quarter, PICA did a really thoughtful analysis where they paired up the departments that had high vacancy rates and the larger overtime expenditures, and you can really see the interplay there. One of the things about being in a really good economy right now, it means that it is, for some of our departments in some areas, challenging to fill positions. And when we can't fill those positions, but the services need to be delivered, sometimes we need to rely on overtime. The reason we do the quarterly city managers report, though, is we want to make sure that we are making the most effective use of those overtime dollars as we can and really monitoring that. So we look at it each quarter. It is an area of concern, but we can see in some areas that there are certain economic pressures and trends so that our overall Class 100 spending is still on track, but the break between straight wages and overtime, that we see a shift.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Council Member. I have a few questions, but I want to recognize that Council Member Helen Kim has joined us. I have a few questions I just wanted to ask.
Okay.
First of all, congratulations on your position as Budget Director.
Thank you.
And I'm sure you're going to do a great job, so congratulations. Can you tell us the kind of things that the Budget Office is doing to find savings across all the departments?
Certainly. So as part of the annual budget process, the beginning of December, we ask all departments to basically say, tell us what you need for the upcoming fiscal year, what more revenues do you need? But what we did this year also was ask for cut scenarios. And what that means is we asked departments, if you had to this year, we said spend 3% less, 5% less, what would you do? And part of that for us was recession readiness planning, because we wanted to make sure that if we do find ourselves in a recession and if it is sudden, that we are not surprised in making decisions on the fly, but that we have well thought out, vetted plans. But as part of that, there's also just that nice opportunity for reflections, that we're able to sit down with departments, have them evaluate, are there areas where they could be spending less? Are there areas where they would shift, that maybe they would stop spending on this and start spending on that? And so we have those conversations with departments on an ongoing basis and found that some of them said, you know what, actually, we identified areas where we don't need to spend this anymore and we'd rather redirect it to that. So that's a constant process that we go through with departments while we're evaluating their budgets.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. The wage and birth tax are coming in over original projections. And what's our projected fund balance looking like for the end of this year?
Certainly. So I guess it was last week, when we released the QCMR, we said that we've revised our FY20 fund balance projection to be $352 million. That's an increase from the prior quarter. We had been at 307, however, still significantly below the 439 that we were at last year. So we are sort of just getting there, sort of meeting the low end of our 6 to 8% goal.
And I'm not sure this is a question for you or for Rob. In the road to 80, the pension, can you give us an idea where we are right now for funding?
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, the road to 80% had several components, all of which are actually in place now. One, through negotiations with the unions and partnership with council, we got changes in both collective bargaining agreements and in what exempts and non-reps do for pensions. So contributions went up and the design of the plan changed so that it's a combination of a defined benefit plan with a 401k plan. That's meant that assets have gone up because of the increased contributions, and the growth in liabilities has started to slow because of the change in the design. We've also put in more money from the sales tax. Remember, state legislation moved some of the sales tax over to pensions. We've required that be above the MMO, the state required amount that we put in. So all that has helped with our funding. It's meant that last year, for the first time in decades, the pension fund was cash flow positive even without investment earnings. And it's meant that, according to our actuary, by the end of the current 5-year plan, we'll be at about 60% funded, up from the mid-40s, and that's with more conservative assumptions about things like earnings and mortality. When Pew looked at our pensions, they said that even if we miss our earnings assumptions, we will continue to see improvements in our funding percent.
Wait a second, I just want to make sure I understood. When is it going to be 60% funded?
The end of the 5-year plan period.
End of 5 years from now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good news. Thank you. One last question. With the recent drop in interest rates that are dramatic, are we focused on refinancing a lot of our debt that we could get much more attractive rates today?
Yeah, we've done a couple of things. We've done refundings across our credits, so the general fund, water fund, aviation, we've looked for any opportunity. We've also gotten out of some of our interest rate swaps to reduce our exposure to variable rate over time. So we've done both of those.
That's good. Okay, thank you. Chair would like to recognize Councilmember Greene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to both of you. I just wanted to follow up with some questions based on some of the things that were stated and also some of the information provided. Ms. Wax, I'm curious in reference to, I'm looking at this article from, not sure the public, oh, okay, I'm sorry, this is from Pew. And it compares Philadelphia to a bunch of other cities. And I'm curious if you have any perspective on where we are from our rainy day fund dollars compared to cities like Detroit or Baltimore.
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure where they're at, and sometimes it's not apples to oranges. One of the things I do know is Detroit actually has a much higher fund balance from us, but that's actually because their credit rating is so bad they can't borrow money, so
Exactly.
they need, if they want to make those investments, to do that. So there are times where, you know, having these super high fund balance of, say, Detroit, that actually indicates you've got other fiscal challenges. That's sort of a point in time. And so we do look at ourselves in terms of our peers, but also trying to be mindful that sometimes there are different conditions on the ground.
Okay, and that may be a question for the next speaker, especially I'm curious about Baltimore, Kansas City, Cincinnati, and Cleveland in reference to where they are from a rainy day fund. Some other questions. You talked earlier that we now have a recession reserve of about $20 million, and that's on top of the federal funding contingency fund. So we're looking at about $70 million.
Yeah.
I know the mayor's going to give the budget address next week, and we'll be seeing the new 5-year plan for FY21 through 25. Do you anticipate that same $70 million throughout the 5-year plan?
I think we'll be able to talk more about the whole mix and balance of reserves. There'll be some changes across the 4 reserves that I mentioned before, trying to be mindful of all of the different needs that we have.
But the goal is to try to the extent possible maintain that level of that reserve fund, which includes both recessionary as well as what used to be the federal funding.
Yeah,
contingency.
we're trying to balance a couple of different goals. One is just our sort of plain vanilla fund balance and making sure that that's good. We also look at those recession reserves at the same time, trying to balance that with our labor reserves and then the service needs and making sure that we're able to invest in services in our community. So we're sort of balancing all of those.
And similar to the commentary I had for Mr. Rice, we'll be talking about PICA and Independent Fiscal Office in a future conversation. But I want to revisit the questions I had for him for both of you regarding, do you think that the trigger for the budget stabilization reserve or rainy day fund should be changed as well?
I don't know about whether the trigger should be changed. I do think it would be helpful if there was a change so that we could make deposits at different times in the year. The way it's set up now, we can only do deposits when we're doing the budget. So I think that would be a helpful change.
So basically flexibility to be able to make deposits at different times based on what's happening from your projections and the projections versus actual
Yes.
numbers. Okay. Mr. DeBow, you also talked a little bit about the pension, and the chair had a colloquy in reference to where we are from a pension funding balance that will be at about 60%. I
By the
believe,
end of the 5
by
years.
by FY25. But you also said something earlier about the MMO, or minimal municipal obligation, and I wanted to make sure I heard you say that last year we actually put in more than MMO.
Yeah, so we've actually been funding the pension fund according to something called the revenue recognition policy, which is an amount that's higher than the state required minimum municipal obligation. So it's that MMO plus the contributions that employees agreed to make during part of the last collective bargaining process, plus the additional sales tax. In addition, in the last couple of years, when our fund balances come in at higher amounts than we anticipated, we've put in additional funding over those amounts into the pension fund.
And was last year the first year that actually occurred, or that also occurred in years prior?
That happened the year before, too. So, it's been
So
happening.
last 2 fiscal years, we actually put in more than MMO.
More, I think the revenue recognition policy we may have been doing for 3 years, but then we've put in amounts above the revenue recognition policy for the last couple of years.
Gotcha. Okay. Also, I just want to follow up on some back and forth that we had regarding overtime versus hiring. One of the things that's occurred through a number of administrations is that I would say you can go back from the good administration on through. A number of administrations have not hired as much as people have left the city. And that's been a way of trying to address some of our budget constraints by not replacing people when they leave. And that's caused our population, our census of employment to go down over time. And because of that perspective, the hiring I think there's been a focus on not doing as much hiring, and that's put more of a pressure on overtime, which I think, Ms. Waxman, you talked about that tension. Is there a way we can kind of change that perspective? And I know now because that's been a unofficial policy for a period of time, but now we're in a very robust employment perspective, and so that's caused an inability to hire because many more people are employed, although we still have a high unemployment rate here in the city of Philadelphia, and especially for people of color. So I guess the question is, how do we start to try to change that dynamic? I mean, I know we're going through labor contracts that'll also be part of that conversation. So I wanted to get a question on that.
So I think you sort of are noting that tension there about not wanting to hire, wanting to hire. And I think that as you'll see as we move forward with the FY21 to 25 plan, that we are putting an emphasis on trying to hire. There are certain areas where we are doing more to try and broaden the base of folks who sort of come into the hiring pool, reach out more broadly, particularly to reach out to communities of color to make sure that our recruitment is really robust and wide. But we know that there are certain areas that right now, particularly skilled trades, that we are having a very hard time simply because we can't commit. In certain areas, one of the things we have already tried to do is push up the salaries in certain hard to fill areas so that we could attract more folks when we're really trying to get folks, who might have other opportunities elsewhere. Also, the Chief Administrative Officer office is working with OHR to figure out different ways. How do we reduce the time to hire? How do we streamline that process? How do we make sure that also our retention is there? So that once people are on board with us, they stay. And so there are a number of different opportunities where we're trying to bring folks on board and make sure that that is an inclusive and successful process. And we'll be able to talk more about that throughout the budget process.
Okay. We are going through on the precipice of what many people are calling a silver tsunami, where in a number of industries, employment sectors, you have a significant wave of people, as my father would say, seasoned employees that will be leaving the workforce. And so that's going to have additional pressures on our ability to address this overtime versus hiring dynamic. Wanted to also ask you talked about in the budget process, which every year the budget office reaches out to various departments to provide their budgets for the year. And although we are in a better economic situation than we've been in for a number of years, you still requested those various departments to provide data on what it would look like if they had a 3% reduction. I think that's actually a good idea to start to do that and not only do it in a recessionary context.
Yep.
But there's been conversations over the years about zero-based budgeting, and there's been stops and starts in that regard. Can you give some perspective on how we get to that concept? And does this initiative you started as budget director help us to move in that path?
And I will say that I'm not the first budget director to ask for cut scenarios.
Let me just correct the record. I know Mr. DeBelle has done that as well, but often we've had to do that because we were facing very significant financial perspectives. This is one of the first times I remember hearing that you've asked departments to make those presentations on reductions when we have not been such dire straits.
Did not make me super popular. Right now the city uses program-based budgeting, which is really focused on tying performance with the budget, but also making sure that you understand every bit of that. I think that there really is a bridge between that zero-based budgeting and the program-based budgeting, because when you start looking at a department's spending and breaking it down into meaningful chunks that are actual services we deliver. This is the sanitation program. This is, what we put into inspecting restaurants. That gives you that opportunity to figure out, okay, this is the level of service we're providing. Is it not enough, too much, just the right size? And so going through those cut scenarios, one of the ways that we asked departments to think about this is, and we asked for a 3% and a 5%. 3%, we said, it's fine sort of if you want to look at those incremental reductions, if you want to snip a little here, snip a little there. But when looking at those 5%, we asked them to think more about, are there lines of service that you would discontinue? That maybe instead of a scenario where you do 5 things, not nearly up to snuff, would you want to look at doing 4 things but doing them all really well? And so that creates that opportunity to sort of think in both frameworks, both the incremental cuts as well as changing just sort of generally what services we provide. And part of the thought process around that is thinking about, say we were to go into a recession. If it is long and deep, you might really need to think about, what services do we as a city provide? If it's short and we're looking to just sort of get through till we get back to normal, then maybe you don't need to have those conversations. So we're trying to have both, so that I think that second area, the deeper in thinking through what do we do and not do, gets closer to that zero-based budgeting. And the other is more of that incremental approach. And we really like to, on both of those approaches, think about what does that mean for service delivery, so that if we were to cut your dollars here, or if you had less resources to do X, what does that mean in terms of days to process whatever, or how long we, or how many services we can provide. Sorry.
One final question. And prior to the influx of the coronavirus and some of the...
I promise I don't have that. I've been to the doctor.
Okay. I don't have my mask with me either, but I'm not sure how much mask will cover me. But... Yeah. I'm going to leave that alone. But prior to the influx of the coronavirus and also some of the concerns regarding trade and tariff wars with China, most economists projected very low possibility of a recession in this year going into next year. That may change, but based on the conversations we've had today, and even with the possibility of even a future recession, most economists have said that recession will not nearly be as challenging as the prior recession we came out of a couple years ago. It would be a quicker, not as impactful. However, we have, for lack of a better word, a school district recession on the horizon. I'd asked a question to Harvey Rice about his concerns regarding the financial conditions of the school district, especially now that we have local control. And when you look at that issue, plus the labor contracts that we're currently negotiating now, and also the need to have a better fund balance based on number of indicators that we need, as well as trying to maintain the reserve and federal funding contingency. What are your thoughts on that going forward?
So the current 5-year plan includes a historic level of funding from the city to the school district, over $1.2 billion. And your question really gets to the heart of those trade-offs we're trying to constantly balance. The immediate needs, clearly our school district has immediate needs, with making sure that we also have reserves so that we can continue to provide services this year throughout the 5-year plan, come what may in the economy. And so that is something that we carefully look at as we develop the budget and the 5-year plan, and talking with the school district to understand what their needs are.
Mr. DeBow?
Yeah, I think that what you've gone through is a really good way of highlighting all the challenges we face as we attempt, 1, to put the plan together, and 2, to prepare for a recession. All of those are major issues, and that's what we're grappling with as we try to put a plan together for next week.
Okay, so we'll look to see your thoughts in next week's budget address and the 5-year plan for FY21 to 25. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Greene, and the chair would like to recognize Councilmember Kim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. So I'm going to just continue along with the line of questioning that Councilmember Greene had asked about schools.
I thought you might.
I'm sorry?
I thought you might.
So he, we got rid of the MOU, which allowed a continuation, maintenance of effort
Maintenance of
agreement
effort, right.
between, I should have said an MOE, maintenance of effort agreement between the school district and the city of Philadelphia. At the time, it made a lot of sense, particularly during the years in which I think what we found is that the school districts, in my opinion, seemed to see like a lagging indication from the impact of the recession. So while the recession may have hit most cities' businesses during, I think my colleague would have said maybe between the years of 2008 to 2011, the district's devastating budget through the state really hit between 2012. We closed down the 24 public schools in January of 2013. September of 2013 opened with 4,000 less staff. Schools closed, and then that continued through until we started reversing that most recently in 2016, so, and 2017. So have you thought about how, I know that there's going to need to be ongoing dialogue, and I do think that we need to make sure that the school district itself is included, but have you thought about the impact of like a recession plus a lagging potential for a lagging kind of impact on one of the most significant entities that cannot raise its own money, unfortunately, relies heavily and probably too much so, but increasingly more on local funding, what that might look like, because it actually, in my opinion, drags out the length of time that we might have. I'd also be curious if you agree that you think that the district somewhat lagged, whereas we saw investments continue at a marginal rate, certainly not robustly, but not the kinds of severe cuts that we saw that really, frankly, devastated a lot of communities, had tremendous impact on children and neighborhoods across the city.
So the school district definitely lagged last time. I think part of the reason for the lag was the influx of stimulus money that the district used to make investments into hire staff. And I think the big hit they took was when that stimulus money went away and the new governor decided not to try to replace those funds. So I'm not sure that in a new recession that they would lag again. I think that they might take a hit, fairly quickly as we would, which makes planning with them, as you're saying, even more important.
Yeah, okay. And then do you have opinions about where you would be on maintenance of effort? Should that be a situation in which, again, the district cannot raise its own funds. A lot of our delivery to the district is delivered through grants, so it's not necessarily through, it's relatively, we're committed, obviously. They have a 5-year plan. We have a 5-year plan. On the other hand, it is somewhat discretionary because it's given through a grant process as opposed through property tax delivery or something that is formula-based as opposed to negotiated.
So, broadly, the state should be the prime funder, and the city should provide reliable funding to the district, and together that should be a sufficient amount of funding for the district to provide the services it needs to provide. I think the maintenance of effort was kind of a plus and a minus. It was a plus in that it gave the district some security that they knew that city funding wouldn't go down. On the other hand, it made us much more cautious about providing funding to the district. Something, for example, was a one-time thing. It was much harder to do that because you couldn't give, there was a year we wanted to give $50 million for a specific item. The issue was how do you get around the maintenance of effort? And so it was actually, in some cases, a bar to giving money to the district. So I'm not sure that it would actually help the district in the long run as much as the city and the state living up to the commitments.
I think one of the questions would be that I think that the ability to do large-scale grants at different points in time, like for example, if we wanted to fund, a big schools investment, for example, that might sunset at some different point in time down the road, is a much different financial scenario. I mean, I am curious about where you would be somewhat on a maintenance of effort through a recessionary period, because actually you don't really, I think what the district has consistently said to us about its problems, particularly with the state and with the federal government, which can withdraw money actually, because again, a lot of the district's money is dependent upon grants and negotiated delivery as opposed to do right, which is really what we should be moving towards. I think what we heard repeatedly from them was that stability and predictability is their main interest, even when that may not be like incredibly generous, but that in times of downturn and economic downturn, stability and predictability are more important than whether or not they can get like a sort of, I don't know, like I wouldn't call it a windfall, but like a break in case something like goes horrifically bad.
Right. I can completely hear what you're saying, and I would not want us to reduce funding to the district in a recession, because then we're just kind of doubling down on their problems. I think our putting money in each year of the 5-year plan gives them some stability because they can see what we're planning to do. So the combination of, I mean, in some ways, that gives them some assurance that they'll get that money regardless of what happens in the economy, whereas property tax, the UNO, income tax, those can all go down and will go down when the economy turns. Our giving them a contribution actually kind of is a steady state of funding.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the current relationship with the district is strong enough to have like good, stable, predictable, reliable conversations about the district's financial path?
I think it is. We have regular meetings with CFO of the school district. We go to their finance and facilities committee meetings. There are regular discussions between the school district chief of staff, mayor's chief of staff, between the superintendent and the mayor, and between the board in the mayor's office. So there's a lot of dialogue. I think the relationship is very strong.
And you think they've been like accurate, for example, about predicting like facilities conditions or the need for facilities? They have a good assessment on terms of infrastructure and the fact that 10 schools closed this year, for example.
Yeah.
Since September.
I mean, obviously, any large organization has challenges, but that's different from our having kind of a good working relationship with them on their operations and their finances.
Yeah. 10 schools did close down since September, though.
Yes.
So one last question for Marisa, and congratulations on your new position as budget director. Who like, when we give out city grants or subsidies, traditionally, they might be delivered through the Commerce Department and others, and we've done legislation that requests that there's some feedback on subsidies, is when it's specifically related to job growth, job development, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Does anyone ever do any like evaluation of economic subsidy grants in terms of like how they contribute back to budget revenues or to tax revenue or growth and overall? Is that your department that actually does that?
So what I would say is actually there was somewhat recent legislation that put in place looking at job incentives, and so the Commerce Department took the lead, but with help from the Revenue Department, the Budget Office, the Finance Office, doing an evaluation starting with some of the incentive and subsidy programs for when businesses are granted funds. And so they completed an analysis and delivered recommendations on a number of programs, but it's sort of a rolling basis, so different programs will get evaluated each year. And that's actually what then led to the inclusive growth strategy that was released by the Department of Commerce, talking about how we could sort of pivot and make some adjustments based on how our current sort of suite of programs were performing against sort of expectations in job growth, but also in terms of inclusivity and other factors, and also compared to what the market was for incentives from other jurisdictions.
Right. And just to be clear, that also includes like revenue. Carol.
Sorry.
That's okay. Do you need more water?
I'm fine.
Revenue and that also includes just revenue and overall like tax payments, like defaults, that kind of thing with the entities that receive the subsidies. Is that accurate? Like you'll consider that as part of that conversation?
Yeah, so that was part of that.
Because sometimes it's just limited to jobs, and I want to make sure
so
that...
what they would be looking at is sort of the ROI on those incentives is one of the things they analyzed. They used an outside firm who had done this for a number of different cities, and so that factored into that analysis.
Mm-hmm. And then do you internally do that within revenue? Or is this mostly like outsourced,
So
that
for
analysis?
different programs, it varies.
So you can take a rest.
Okay, yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
So it's a combination. So sometimes it's outside firms, sometimes it's our revenue department or revenue department working in combination with commerce and budget. So it really, it varies by analysis.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Kim. I have one comment, just like to hear your thoughts on it, and that is I know that we have a very, very large percentage of our economy that's eds and meds, educational institutions and medical institutions. And while in boom times we're always complaining they don't pay real estate taxes or business taxes, in downturns, thank God we have them because they are very stable in our economy, very stable.
Yeah.
So we don't have the big downs as other cities do. And now with even the cell therapy that the University of Penn is doing, the tremendous cell therapy, I actually think, in my opinion, that if we experience a downturn in Philadelphia, it may not be as severe as it will be in other areas, which I think is a positive. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
I can talk about it. So one of the things that we did with our stress testing in the late fall was actually look back to the past 3 recessions and look by tax type. And one of the things we found was our wage tax, which, with our very large eds and med sector, even in the last recession, which was the largest of the 3 we looked at in terms of depth and length, our wage tax receipts were paused as opposed to declined. And that was a really interesting finding, I think speaks to what you're talking about, whereas our tax types that are on for-profit businesses, particularly the net income portion of the BERT, saw tremendous amounts of volatility. And then there are some tax types that are more volatile based on the market that is sort of a mix of the nonprofit and the for-profit, our realty transfer tax. And so we do see that there is a certain steadiness there's an interplay. We've in part got the economic sort of makeup we have because of the tax structure we have and vice versa, and an interplay there that the wage tax is our number 1 tax source, and that captures the for and nonprofit sectors.
I think that's a very interesting fact that you brought up, that the wage tax stayed steady basically in a downturn. That's very, very comforting, very important for us to know, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, really what we saw in the last recession, the first hits were in the BERT and the transfer tax and a little bit in the sales tax, but not as much in the wage tax.
That's good. Okay. Chair would like to recognize Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for your testimony again. I just have a very quick question relative to our municipal budgeting model. I believe this is our first year moving all of our city departments to program-based budgeting, correct?
All the mayoral agencies are now doing program-based budgeting. It's been sort of a 4-year rollout to get folks in. So some departments it's year 4, and for some it's year 1.
Sure. So in my studies in grad school, and I applied to a PhD program around program-based budgeting and different municipal budgeting models. So it is an interest area of mine. Typically after year 3 or year 4, you have realized savings in your change in the budgeting model. Have we seen any realized savings as we've changed our municipal budgeting model in the city?
I think that one of the things that it has really allowed us to do is figure out where we want to direct those resources. Unfortunately, Philadelphia, our needs are still up here and our resources are down here. And so what it lets us do is sort of figure out where we're getting the biggest bang for our buck. So one of the, I would say, success stories that we've really seen through program-based budgeting was the health department came and showed us, you know what, it's a really long lag, I think it was up to 17 or 18 months between restaurant inspections. And to make sure that Philadelphia residents and visitors are eating in healthy and clean establishments, they really wanted to get to a much shorter window. And what they were able to say was, if you give us X amount of dollars, we're going to translate that into resources, and we'll be able to show you through this measure that now we're actually getting to their goal they set themselves was 12 months. And actually with those extra resources, they were able to start a rotation where they were getting on average every 11 months. And so what the program-based budgeting is really allowing us to do is make sure that when we're investing dollars, we're getting results. So it's less about, figuring out, where we've been spending too much, but figuring out where we can spend to get the biggest impact.
Okay, so more on service delivery and improving our service delivery to citizens. Quickly around the increase in pay-as-you-go capital spending. Now with our interest rates being at a historic low and thinking about our capital needs over time, have you all been having discussions around how we're planning our capital needs relative to what we're able to do based on the funds that we have now, and then if and when something occurs, the interest rates obviously would go up. How are we planning for that relative to our capital needs?
So we try and be very thoughtful, understanding, one, what are our infrastructure needs? And we are an old city. We are a city built for a lot more people than currently live here. There's a lot to maintain, and we know that putting those investments in existing and new facilities, the need is here. One of the things we've been doing is our capital program is actually a 6-year program, and so similar to the 5-year plan, we do try and be strategic in terms of understanding, first of all, what dollars we can put in without actually having to borrow. And so one of the things we were able to do during the last mid-year transfer ordinance process was allocate $47 million for pay-as-you-go capital investments. And so what that does for us is, one, it lets us address needs that were unmet, that, because clearly there are needs that are unmet. Also, other things, it lets us sort of avoid borrowing for certain things that we had been planning to in the coming year. And so that helps us reduce our costs because, high interest rate, low interest rate, no interest rate is even better. So that's where we're putting a lot of our attention. And in terms of looking forward, we look a lot at that interplay between the capital program, how much we're borrowing, and what that does to our debt service in the operating budget. Because as we mentioned earlier in the testimony, that between our debt service and our pension obligations, that's 20% of our budget. So we're constantly trying to be mindful that we not squeeze out the funds available for day-to-day service delivery by locking ourselves into those fixed costs. So we're constantly balancing the two, and right now a lot of our focus has been on when we can doing that pay-as-you-go capital financing. Another thing, though, to mention about interest rates and what we do, the market is going to have interest rates change, but the control we do have is doing what we can to try and improve our credit rating. And so the Treasurer's Office was able to share with me that right now our credit rating is A, which is if we were one rung below that at BBB. Right now, the difference on $100 million borrowing in our interest would be about $332,000. If we were able to get our credit rating up to a AAA, the strongest there is, we would save $690,000 compared to if we were at that BBB level. So being able to improve our fiscal condition, improve our credit rating, saves us money. And the second thing that I haven't gotten to mention yet, but I'm really just going to share with you, even though you...
One thing about that.
Yeah.
So the other thing in the way our bonds have been selling, not only have they been selling better because we're rated better, they've been selling better compared to the kind of the standard benchmarks for other jurisdictions rated at our same rating. So we're actually trading even better than in A, and I think part of that is because of what the market sees us doing with our fund balances, what they see us doing with our pensions. So they like the progress we're making, and that kind of translates into better results when we go to the markets.
Yeah, and the thing I want to add on to that is the other thing, the past 2 years, the City of Philadelphia was able to avoid doing a tax revenue anticipation note, which In periods of time where we didn't have enough cash on hand to pay the bills early in the year before those real estate tax receipts and BERT receipts came in, we would have to borrow money. From the 70s until 2018, we had to do those tax revenue anticipation notes every year but for one. The past 2 years, we didn't have to do that. We had enough cash on hand that we were able to make it through. What that did was, in terms of the interest savings and the straight up borrowing cost, saves us $2.3 million. That was the average cost of doing that in the 4 years before we were able to not do that. So being fiscally responsible, that really does free up cash today. And so those are the sorts of trade-offs. And by paying attention to our fiscal health really does make sure that we can address all of the needs of Philadelphians on the service side.
And where we've really gone in 10 years, we've gone from having to meet weekly to figure out whether there were vendors that we had to delay paying because cash was so weak to not having to do cash flow borrowings.
And just really quickly, I wanted to follow up on the line of questioning from my colleague, Councilmember Kim, relative to the school district. How were you thoughtful in the planning of this upcoming budget around the increase, not only capital, but really operating expenses the district has incurred relative to the lead and asbestos issues that have been happening in the district? Did you give any consideration to that in your planning, and could you just talk about that?
Yeah, and part of our ongoing conversations with the district are about their projections for their needs and how they want to handle things like facilities in their budget, and then how that reflects back to what we need to do. So that's definitely been part of our conversation with them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember. Thank you for your testimonies today, and you should have some chicken soup, Marisa, but thank you very much. Thank you, Rob. Clerk, please call the next panel.
Tom Ginsburg?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please state your full name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Thomas Ginsburg. I'm a senior officer at the Pew Charitable Trust's Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative. We're a project that produces analyses of key issues and engages with decision makers on policies. Pew has done extensive research on the fiscal tool that we've talked about today, Rainy Day Fund, known here as the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund, which, along with other budgetary control actions, is a useful way for coping with and sometimes taking advantage of volatility in government revenues that often follow swings in the economy and the tax base, both up and down. Governments use rainy day funds to help ensure that they can keep providing essential services and shouldering liabilities if or when their revenues fall after an extreme event or an economic slump. This starts with putting away a certain prescribed amount into a dedicated reserve during good times, and that involves picking the optimum formula and the timing of the deposit. Our research has found that Philadelphia is one of 18 major U.S. cities that currently use this tool in one form or another. New York City actually is the latest to consider joining this group of cities. We at Pew held a convening on the topic in October 2018. At that event, an official from Los Angeles said that he sees his city's rainy day fund as one part of a toolkit for fiscal policy. He said, quote, "We don't want to be in crisis management in the next downturn. We want as many tools as possible for when times are not as good as they are now." There's a lot to learn on this subject from state governments, where rainy day funds are much more common than in cities. 48 states, including Pennsylvania, currently have a dedicated economic reserve fund of some kind. Our research has found that there are some common elements in those state funds, common elements of well-designed funds. What we found that well-designed funds are codified in law, that they are institutionalized with clear goals, such as protection from a downturn. And that's important to getting the most benefit from it. When the rules and goals are enshrined in law or formal procedures, they have a better chance of remaining in force through changes in elected leadership and budget priorities. And they are transparent for rating agencies and the public. And Philadelphia can check this box. Its fund is codified in the city charter. Deposits, they should be tied to revenue volatility. That is, governments should set up their funds to take advantage of growth in revenue that may not be sustainable otherwise or may be a one-time spike. Philadelphia currently deposits a defined amount based on projected year-end budget surplus, not so much revenue. While this type of rule sometimes works, the research shows in states generally that it does not consistently track closely to actual revenues or economic trends that the city may be experiencing. The amount of the money in the fund also matters. Philadelphia's rainy day fund currently holds about $34.3 million. It was created in 2011 by a ballot measure and sat empty for 7 years. In 2019, after several years of revenue growth, the Kennedy administration, using those rules, the same rules that are laid out in the charter, made the first deposit. Like other cities, Philadelphia has also other reserves you've talked about here today, set up for various purposes. On withdrawals, the experience of states shows that the importance of clear rules on withdrawals. Officials should withdraw money only when the indicators related to their goals show that the time is right, such as a measure of economic slowdown or declines in revenue. And they should stop withdrawals when those measures show that the economic conditions and revenue volatility has actually improved. In Philadelphia, the withdrawal rules in the charter are pegged to revenues as well as expenditures. They state that the city can make withdrawals when actual prior revenues came in at least 1% below the year's official projections, or when necessary in the current year to pay for emergency services or to avoid material disruption in services. So aside from all those elements, having a codified purpose and having effective deposit and withdrawal rules, there is a key benefit of having a well-designed rainy day fund, and that is credit agencies look at them when judging a government's fiscal condition. Our research has found that agencies tend to look favorably on governments that strictly follow their rules both for deposits and withdrawals. In fact, the leading agencies, everything else equal, usually do not penalize the government for taking money out of a rainy day fund during downtowns, as long as they do it in accordance with the rules that they set out. In other words, both depositing and withdrawing under the rules can be a credit positive. As one analyst said during our event, if you have a reserve policy and you're not implementing it, it's not a strengthening factor for you. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm happy to address any questions I can.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
I have a few questions I wanted to ask. Are you suggesting one of two things? Either we build it into our budget, a certain percentage of our gross revenue goes into a reserve fund every year, no matter what, or are you suggesting that above the budgeted amount of revenue, we take a percentage of that and put it into the reserve?
Well, I don't mean to be suggesting a particular formula. I'm just making the point that we've found in our research that the states that have had rainy day funds for years, they started out with the kind of a formula that Philadelphia has now, which is measuring your budget surplus and using that as an indicator of how much you take out. States have shifted over the years to more of a strictly revenue side analysis, and now looking at the revenue volatility and using perhaps an average of past years' instances where actual revenue came in above projected revenue, apart from whatever the budget says. And when you focus on that side of it, then you get a measure, tend to get a more accurate view of what's happening in the economy and your tax base. So the specific percentage, that's up to each state. Each government sets that through its own process.
Do you have any questions? The chair would like to recognize Councilmember Gilmore Richardson.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your testimony. And just wanted to go back in your testimony where you talked about deposits as well. Philadelphia currently deposits a defined amount based on projected year-end budget surplus. Can you talk about some other municipalities and/or states that utilize the other format where they make contributions throughout the year based on the actual numbers that come in?
Some of our research has looked at Utah. Texas, I believe, has adopted this sort of process. Now, economies are different in those places too, of course, and those are statewide systems rather than our citywide. But as I said, I think around, I'm sorry, I'm doing this from memory a little bit, out of the 48 states, a fair number now have moved over to revenue rules. I could get you the exact list of states that actually do that. And actually just last week ahead of this hearing, we decided to start looking deeper at what cities do in that regard also. So we will dig into that and I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you so much. That'll be most helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have another question for you, actually. Hearing the budget director's testimony about the wage taxes in the prior recessions, that they were basically flat, which I thought was very positive versus going down, I thought was a great indicator of our economy in a downward recession. Have we looked at other cities to see any other indicators that they've lost further than Philadelphia so that we could say we're actually in a better position to weather a downturn?
Well, there are a few things that happen in the economy as happens to the tax base, and some taxes are more exposed to what happens in the economy than others, obviously. Generally speaking, and I can't speak to exactly the comments about the city's wage tax. Generally speaking, income taxes are more susceptible to movement with the economy than, say, property taxes, which tend to be much more stable with ups and downs. And some of our analysis has looked at the state level, and we haven't done as much at the city level. But it goes to my point about revenue volatility. Revenue volatility can be measured, and revenues tend to be more volatile when an area is more dependent on income type taxes rather than property taxes or some other stable source. Now, what was happening specifically in the sector, in the healthcare sector here, which is our biggest sector, it's hard to know. There are a lot of other things in that sector that would affect the wage taxes going up and down. It's by its nature, it's a more stable industry than pick almost any other. So there might have been a lot of things going on there. I can just tell you that our research has shown revenue volatility is higher in places that are more dependent on income type taxes.
In your opinion, we heard the administration saying we're shooting for 8 to 9%, I guess, in reserves, but I guess the accounting professionals are saying that we should be looking closer to 17%. What's your opinion on those two different numbers?
So I don't have an opinion particularly on that. The association, the GFOA, that sets that 17% has been setting that for quite a while, and they've looked at it over the years, and I would just defer to them. It's not the kind of research that we do.
All right, but in simple terms, what they're saying, I guess, is we have 1 month reserves versus 2 month reserves.
That's the way GFO usually phrases it. They can express that either as a percentage, but what is often, they've said, they found more useful is to express it in how many days of funding do you have for your expenditures.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
This concludes the hearing on Resolution 200039. And I want to thank everybody for participating, and I want to thank the sponsor for bringing this forward. Thank you very much. Thank you.